Hey adventurer, welcome back to The Weary Wanderer. Tonight, we're lurching and bumping our way onto the dusty, dangerous trails of the American West. We're here to unpack exactly why being a stagecoach passenger on the American frontier was an experience in relentless misery and constant peril, making it profoundly suck. I'm sure you've seen the old paintings, all sunny and heroic. They show the Concord stagecoach like a grand chariot, rolling across perfect green fields that somehow don't have any bumps, rocks, or angry animals. The passengers, never more than a comfy 4, look serious and brave. Maybe one has a tear in their eye, perfectly placed, as they look at a golden sky full of promise. The horses are always amazing, strong and graceful, like they run on good wishes instead of food. Their manes and tails fly like silk flags, not bothered by sticky plants or biting flies. The driver, a tough guy who's also strangely clean and has great teeth, holds the reins like a calm expert. He might have a cool feather in his hat that, of course, never blows off. Inside, the people are calm and proper. Their clothes are spotless, even after weeks on the trail. The land around them is always amazing. Tall mountains in the background, that they never have to go down with screaming brakes. Clear rivers, with no sickness in them, and the air smells like pine trees and flowers, not like, say, unwashed people and deep sadness. Or maybe you've seen them in old black and white movies, those exciting scenes of escapes and chases. The stagecoach is a ship of adventure. The people inside are brave heroes and fancy ladies on a fun, if sometimes risky trip. When bad guys attack, they're usually over the top and easy to beat. Their bullets, by some miracle, miss everyone important. The hero, maybe a tough gambler with a secret soft spot, or a brave soldier in disguise, handles the bad guys with a few good shots and a smart remark. The heroine, though scared for a moment, hardly ever faints. Her bravery shows on her pretty face. Even a problem like a broken wheel just gives everyone a chance to be friendly and clever, and it's usually fixed before a commercial break, if they had those back then. Cheap novels also told stories of tough frontiersmen and brave women facing the wild from comfy and totally made up stagecoach seats. The trip itself was just a nice background for their exciting adventures, a simple way to get characters from one thrill to the next. These images are strong and stick in our minds, a sign of America growing, a proof of human bravery, a romantic picture of a past time when men were tough, women were good, and the West was just waiting to be taken, like a big empty painting ready for new colors. But let me tell you that these nice ideas are mostly wrong. Being a real stagecoach passenger on the American frontier, my friends, was nothing. And I mean nothing. Like those clean, exciting, or, dare I say it, almost easy pictures. Take away the romance, pull off the layers of sweet old stories, turn off the heroic music, and what you have left is an experience so awful in so many ways that it makes a 16-hour flight today, stuck in the middle seat on a cheap plane next to a crying baby and a coughing man, feel like a first-class trip to a dreamland with endless free drinks and your own massage therapist. It was a ride that shook your bones, made your backside numb, filled your mouth with dust, and rearranged your insides. It was a constant, close-up attack on your body and your mind. It was a long lesson in putting up with things you shouldn't have to. A gamble where you could win only long-lasting, soul-crushing pain or a quick, messy, and often forgotten death. It was a concert of suffering that went on for weeks, sometimes months. The main music came from your own sore joints, clicking and grinding like old rusty door hinges. Then there was the steady, sad creak and groan of the coach's wood, like it was in pain too. Add the annoying, never-ending buzz of flies landing on your sweat and dirt, and the quiet, desperate prayers for it all to just stop. For most people who lived through it, who trusted their lives and their small amounts of money to this moving torture machine, it was a trip that sucked in many new and soul-breaking ways. Deeply, completely, and in every way possible. We're talking about a level of suck that hit your body, your mind, your friendships, your food, and even very strongly your nose. Every part of you was under attack. Every sense was insulted. Every hope for comfort was crushed, one by one. Think about being sealed in a small, stuffy wooden box with 8 or 9 other unwashed strangers who were getting angrier by the minute. Add the constant shaking of a badly kept cement mixer. Throw in wild changes in heat and cold, a diet that a goat wouldn't eat, the constant threat of deadly sickness or violent attack, and then make that last for hundreds or even a couple of thousand miles. That, my friends, starts to get close to how it really was. So, before we hook up our imaginary suffering horses and rush into this party of frontier pain, this deep look into past misery, if you like to explore the darker, smellier, and much more real side of history, please take a second to show your good taste. Like this video and subscribe to The Weary Wanderer. We're good at digging up the uncomfortable truths hidden under the big statues and a country's chosen memories. We dust them off and show them in all their awful detail. And, as always, if you've ever had a truly terrible travel time yourself, maybe a modern mess with 16 flight changes, a lost suitcase with your wedding clothes, and an airline helpline run by mean badgers, or maybe an old family story about a trip that went so wrong it became a legend, please share your own sad story in the comments below. We really believe that people in misery like to have company. Here at The Weary Wanderer, you're always with friends who get that sometimes the trip itself is the main point, especially if the point is to feel a deep, shared, and good to let out frustration. Now then, if you're sitting comfortably, maybe in a soft armchair or on a supportive couch, something that doesn't fight with your bones every time you move, that's a real treat our Stagecoach passenger could only dream about, even in their wildest drug-help daydreams. Maybe pour yourself a cool, clean drink. Enjoy how clear it is, how it doesn't have weird bits floating in it, or that faint, nasty taste of pond scum and sadness, unlike the warm, often dirty water they had to save, if they were lucky enough to get any. Take a deep breath of the fresh, clean air in your room. Think about how different it is from the choking cloud of dust, made of dirt, dried animal poop, and the dried-up dreams of earlier travelers. Old sweat, and a truly amazing collection of strange human smells that filled that tight wooden box. Close your eyes for a moment if you want, not to sleep, because sleep was a rare and precious thing on the trail, often grabbed in short, shaky bits, but to get your mind ready. Get ready to be shaken, thrown around, beaten up, and generally made confused and upset. Get ready to feel dirt in your teeth, a deep ache in your bones that won't go away, a cold fear of what's hiding just past the thin cloth windows, and a growing, helpless anger at everyone and everything around you, maybe even at your own dumb self for starting such a trip. We are about to go on a journey, not through a pretty, faded picture past, but through the miserable, often scary, and almost always painful truth of stagecoach travel in the American West. Let's float down this river of hardship together and see just how deep, dark, and smelly its waters really were. So, who was this tired person, this soon-to-be human punching bag, our stagecoach passenger? It's a very rare person who wakes up one morning in soft silk sheets, sips their perfect tea and says, "Well now, I think I'll go through weeks of painful, dirty, dangerous travel in a tiny wooden box. Sounds like a great adventure." No. The choice to take a stagecoach across the huge, rough American frontier was hardly ever made for fun or a desire for a bit of discomfort. More often, it was a choice made in very hard times, forced by great need, or whispered in their ear by the tempting, lying voice of overblown promises. You weren't so much called to it, like a fancy job. You were more likely pushed, poked, or tricked into it, like a cow being led into a vat of acid. This wasn't picking a job. It was picking a life, often the only life they felt they could get. It was a narrow, risky path leading from one kind of bad situation to another, hopefully, slightly less bad. 1. Money problems were a big reason. A skinny, pushy boss whose cold hands grabbed at many families. Think of the farmer in New England, his rocky, tired ground giving less food each year. The money he owed for his farm grew like storm clouds. His kids got thinner, their clothes more worn out. The West, he heard people whisper with hope at the town store, or read in cheap papers, was a land of rich, black dirt. It was like a dream garden where wheat grew as tall as a person and corn almost jumped off the plant. Or think of the factory worker in a dirty eastern city. His days were a dull, loud, risky grind for barely enough money to live. His lungs were full of cotton bits or coal smoke. His small, packed apartment was filled with the sounds of other people coughing and feeling hopeless. The stories from the frontier, even if not true, might tell of gold nuggets just lying on the ground in places called Last Chance Gulch. They might tell of huge forests ready to be cut down by any strong man with a good axe. They might tell of new towns popping up fast, needing workers, blacksmiths, carpenters, men to make wheels. Any workers for pay that sounded like a fortune compared to what he made. Maybe a money crisis, like the big ones in 1837 or 1857, had taken his job. The factory gates were locked. He was left with no home, standing in lines for soup with no money. In times like these, the West wasn't just a chance. It was a last desperate try. It was a chance to get away from people he owed money to, away from hunger, away from the awful feeling of being a failure, and that no one cared. It was an act of belief, often a blind belief, that somewhere, anywhere else, had to be better than where he was. Maybe he'd heard that out west. A potato crop didn't just fail 3 years in a row due to blight, or that a man's small shop wouldn't be burned down by thugs hired by a bigger, meaner shop owner. Any story of escape from the daily grind of poverty could sound like a song from heaven. Social reasons, too, played their sneaky part. Maybe our traveler was running from a bad name they couldn't shake, a messy love affair that got everyone in a strict town talking, a business deal that went very wrong and left a lot of angry people who lost money, a mistake made when young that proper folks, with their long memories and little forgiveness, wouldn't let go. The frontier offered a chance to be unknown, a chance to start fresh, to be seen not for past mistakes, but for how hard you work now and what you might do in the future, if you lived long enough to show it. Maybe it was the tight grip of a small, nosy village, where every move was watched and anything different was met with tight lips, raised eyebrows, and quiet, mean gossip. The huge, empty wilderness, even with its real dangers, might seem like a welcome break from being watched and judged by society. Or maybe it was a bad family situation. A bossy father telling you what to do all the time, a nagging wife or husband making home feel like a war zone, a future that was already planned out from birth to death, with boring, soul-killing sameness. The need to just run away, to break free from these unseen chains, to breathe air that wasn't full of what others expected or thought, could become a huge, powerful urge. For some, it was the law itself they were running from. The West was a big, messy, safe place, where a man with a fast horse, a quick gun, and a not too strict idea of right and wrong might just disappear into the empty lands, leaving arrest papers and wanted signs to get dusty. Some were simply misfits, square pegs in the round holes of Eastern society, hoping to find a place where their odd ways wouldn't stick out so much, or where, at least, there were fewer people around to notice. And oh, the tempting lies about the Golden West. This wasn't just a fuzzy hope. It was a business, a well-built tower of stretched truths and plain falsehoods. Little books, printed on cheap paper with even cheaper ink, often paid for by people selling land or new train companies, would show exciting, pretty pictures of life on the frontier. They'd talk about healthy weather, where sickness was never heard of, not mentioning the cholera, bad stomach sickness, smallpox, and common fevers that often killed many in frontier towns. They'd tell of rich valleys where a man could just poke the ground with a hoe and it would burst with more crops than he could handle, forgetting the dry spells that turned fields to dust, the swarms of grasshoppers that could eat a year's work in a day, the hard, sweaty work of clearing wild land, and the constant danger of early frosts or hailstorms. Letters from family already out west, if they even got there after their own risky trip, were often carefully written to leave out the bad parts. They'd talk about small good things, the log cabin finally finished, the first small crop picked, while skipping over the terrible hardships, the loneliness, the fear. They did this partly to look good, and partly to get others to join them and make their own lonely, desperate lives a bit easier, or to have more help. Newspapers, wanting more readers and often paid by those same land sellers, would print exciting articles praising the move west. They pushed brave settlers to grab their great future and help the country grow. You'd hear stories, told by a friend of a friend's cousin, getting bigger with each telling. Stories about some regular guy, a Jed or a Cy, who'd gone west with nothing but dirt under his nails and a happy song. A song that probably died in his throat after the first week on the trail. And now he owned a mountain of gold, or 1,000 fat cows, or was the mayor of some fast-growing city that 6 months before was just coyote poop and dry weeds. These stories, as strong as cheap whiskey, easily left out the many Jeds and Sis who had died from sickness, or been killed in fights or accidents, or had just disappeared into the huge, uncaring land, their dreams turning to dust, like their bones. The pull was less about true facts, and more about a wild, catching hope, like buying a lottery ticket where everyone thought they would be the one to get rich, even though the chances were very much against them. Besides the dream of gold or land, other stranger things pulled people west. Some, believe it or not, were looking for good health. At a time when lung sickness, tuberculosis, that pretty but deadly killer, was common in the crowded, stuffy cities of the East, an idea grew that the dry, clean air of the high plains or the Rocky Mountains could work miracles. Doctors, often knowing as little as their patients and having few good medicines, might suggest a trip west as a last desperate try. And so the truly hopeless, already weak from bad coughs and fevers that wasted their bodies, would put their sick lungs and weak frames through the rough, dusty, tiring stagecoach ride. They hoped for a miracle, but more often, they just found a quicker, more miserable death in a land that was not at all a health spa. The joke of trying to heal your lungs by breathing in clouds of trail dust for weeks was, it seems, lost on them. Religious belief, too, played a big part. Groups trying to get away from bad treatment for their different beliefs, or wanting to build their own perfect towns in the wild, far from the bad ways of the old society, would move in large numbers. For these people, the trip was maybe part of a holy plan, a message from God that might, in their minds, make the suffering okay and give a spiritual meaning to the hardship. Their calling was real, a direct order from their God or their leader to build a new holy city in the empty lands. But God, it seemed, hardly ever stepped in to fix the bumpy roads, or clean the bad water from the alkali springs, or stop the greedy robbers who attacked all travelers, no matter how religious they were. Their faith might have been a strong push from inside, a source of group strength, but it didn't do much to protect them from the everyday endless pains of the trail. And then, of course, there was just plain not knowing, a happy but dangerous lack of knowledge that was almost like asking for trouble. In a time before quick news, before TV shows could clearly show the horrors of, say, crossing a fast river in a tippy wooden box, or what a really bad infected wound looked like, many people planning to travel simply had no real idea what they were getting into. Their idea of the West might come from romance novels about good native people and pretty views, from perfect paintings that left out the mud and the mosquitoes, and from those lying little books that promised a perfect life for the price of a ticket. They might think of it as a tough camping trip, a hard, but in the end good adventure, maybe with a few small problems along the way. The gap between these sweet, hopeful thoughts and the rough, soul-crushing truth of the trip, the dirt, the sickness, the danger, the mind-numbing boredom broken by moments of pure fear, was big enough to swallow hopes, dreams, and often the travelers themselves. The call for these innocent people was the call of something new and unknown, a soft romantic whisper that would soon be drowned out by the loud screech of the coach's wheels, the groans of the other passengers, and their own slow, horrified understanding of the huge mistake they had made. What early training or childhood suffering might have made our future passenger ready for this trip, or more likely, fooled them into thinking they could handle it? For most, it wasn't a real training in how to suffer, no set lessons to make them tough against shaking, starving, and feeling hopeless. It was more like the hard, messy school of a tough life they lived before the trip even started. If our traveler came from a poor farm, they already knew the deep ache of hard work from early morning to late night, the feel of scratchy wool on skin rubbed raw by sweat and work. They knew how mean nature could be, the dry spell that turned crops to dust, the sudden, strong storm that knocked down a barn or killed farm animals, the early frost that ruined a whole season's work in one cold night. They knew hunger, not just as a small bother between good meals, but as a constant familiar ache in the stomach that was hardly ever really gone. Their playground might have been a field full of rocks, their toys the old worn-out tools their parents used, a broken hoe, a dull knife. These things might have taught them a certain quiet strength, a way to put up with hardship without complaining, just because complaining did no good and no one was listening. But the strong, non-stop, all-over attack of a stagecoach trip was a totally different animal. The farmer's strength, built by the steady work of plowing or cutting hay, was not right for the sitting still, bone-shaking tightness of the coach, where muscles hurt not from being used but from not being used and being held in stiff, unnatural ways all the time. If they came from the crowded, dirty slums of a growing factory city, their training was different, but just as hard. They knew about too many people in too little space, the constant loud noise, the smell of garbage and bad drains. They knew about sickness. Cholera, typhus, and lung disease were common in their narrow, dark streets, taking away brothers, sisters, and neighbors with scary speed. Their childhood might have been spent dodging horse carts on busy, stone-paved streets. Their playground might have been a dirty gutter full of gross things. Their toys might have been the trash from richer people, a broken bottle, a piece of cloth. They might have learned to be quick and careful on the streets, to watch out for strangers, to get by in dangerous city areas where fights could start with no warning. But the huge, empty, faceless dangers of the frontier, the bigness of the wild land, not seeing a familiar place or friendly face for hundreds of miles, the deep quiet broken only by a wolf's howl or the wind's scream, was a different kind of danger than a dark street or a drunken fight. The people skills learned in a packed apartment building, the ability to fit in or talk your way out of trouble, were not much help when your only company was a quiet, gun-carrying driver and a few equally miserable strangers, each stuck in their own private misery. The lessons learned from pain and fear in their old lives were many, even if not wanted. The sting of a boss's whip for not paying attention in the factory, the fear of being kicked out of your home when you couldn't pay rent, the constant worry of losing your job when factories closed or crops went bad, the empty ache of losing a child to fever or an accident. These things cut deep into their souls. They might have built a wall around themselves, a hard shell of not caring or expecting the worst, a belief that life was just one hard thing after another. They might have thought, with a kind of dark sense, I've lived through being poor. I've lived through backbreaking work. I've lived through city slums and sickness. For sure, I can live through a trip, no matter how bad, to a place where things have to be better. This was a huge mistake, of course. The skills that helped someone put up with long-term, grinding poverty or boring work didn't always help them put up with sudden, new, and totally strange kinds of suffering. The stagecoach trip wasn't just more hardship. It was hardship of a different and often scarier kind. It was a special class in misery for which their past life, no matter how bad, was only a small and very misleading first step. Their childhood miseries didn't really train them. They just made them willing to accept a lower level of awfulness, making the first choice to get on the stagecoach seem, sadly, like a smart, even hopeful thing to do. And who were the guides leading our traveler to this big and hugely awful choice? It was rarely a wise old person giving good, sensible advice based on a clear look at the good and bad sides. More often, the guides were sellers of dreams, pushers of false hope, or just the echoing voices of everyone else's desperation and lack of knowledge. The main one of these was the stagecoach ticket seller, or the land salesman, a person who should have his own special, very uncomfortable spot in hell. Picture him. Maybe a man in a suit that's a bit too shiny and doesn't fit quite right. His hair greased down, his smile stuck on like a mask of fake cheerfulness that didn't quite match his sharp, watchful eyes. He'd roll out a map, often very wrong and filled with made-up towns and unbelievably rich valleys, pointing to places that sounded like heaven on earth. Golden Valley, Prosperity Creek, New Eden. His voice would be smooth as oily lies, his words a strong mix of love for country and making himself rich. He'd talk about the fast and comfortable ride, maybe waving a hand at a brightly painted, but probably weak and currently empty, coach parked nearby. He'd be sure to forget to mention the 9 other people who would be squeezed in with you, or that its springs were designed by someone who hated people. He'd brush off the dangers with a quick hand wave. Oh, trouble with Indians? Just small fights, sir, made much bigger by the papers back east. Robbers? A fun story mostly. Our drivers have guns and our roads are safe. He'd sell you not just a ticket, but a dream, a pretty package of make-believe about an easy move to a better future, a future where gold lay on the streets and cooked chickens flew into your mouth. His tough teaching method was the hard, complete shock you'd get a few days down the trail. That's when his sweet words would taste like ash in your mouth. The fast and comfortable ride would show itself as a moving torture box, and the healthy weather would turn into choking dust storms or freezing snowstorms. Then there was the sometimes seen successful person back from the West, the man who had supposedly gone out there, faced amazing dangers, and gotten rich. He'd walk proudly into the local bar or store, maybe showing off a piece of gold, which might be his only one, or one he borrowed just to show off. His clothes would be a little too fancy, his stories a little too big. He'd tell the believing, wide-eyed local folk stories of his brave acts, his amazing luck, his huge wealth, all gotten with surprising ease in the rich West. His guidance was a perfect show of remembering only what he wanted, leaving out key facts, and telling plain lies. He'd easily forget the friends who died next to him from cholera, or an arrow in the back, the terrible failures, the months of starving and hopelessness, the deep, soul-killing loneliness. He was selling his own made-up story, making himself look like a hero, and by doing so, tricking others into following his dangerous and probably not repeatable path. His listeners, desperate for the same good luck, would hang on every word. They'd see him not as a rare case or a good liar, but as a real promise of what was waiting for them, if only they were brave enough to try. The written word, too, was a strong but often tricky guide. Those little books we talked about, full of happy stories from made-up settlers, the over-the-top letters from family, who might be writing from a leaky mud hut, with failed crops all around, but desperate to look successful to the people back home, or maybe just wanting company in their misery. The excited newspaper articles written by editors who had a money reason to push people to move west. These all joined in a non-stop chorus of support, a steady beat of, "Go west, young man, and grow with the country." Guidebooks, often written by people who had never actually traveled the roads they wrote about, or whose information was very old by the time it was printed, gave terribly bad advice on everything. They told you what to pack. Usually way too much of the wrong stuff, and not nearly enough of the important things like pain medicine and strong rope. They told you how to handle made-up dangers while ignoring the real, everyday ones that would actually make your life a living hell. This flood of convincing words created an almost unstoppable push, a feeling that everyone was going west, that people were getting rich every day, and that if you stayed behind, you were a fool, a coward, a failure, stuck with a life of hard work and being unknown. Sometimes, the strongest guide was inside you, the nagging voice of your own deep need, the cold fear of a future that seemed to offer nothing but more of the same hard times, the same lack of chances, the same tight social rules you were living under. This inner guide could be cruel. It would paint your current life in the darkest colors, making even the scary, unknown pains of a stagecoach trip seem better than the known, grinding misery of staying where you were. It would whisper that any risk was worth taking, any suffering was worth putting up with, if it gave even a tiny chance at something, anything better. This voice, born from hopelessness and fed by carefully built false dreams, was maybe the most dangerous guide of all. It wouldn't listen to arguments, didn't see any problems, and cared nothing for the true, terrible cost of the trip it pushed you so hard and so convincingly to take. In the end, the calling to get on that stagecoach was rarely a clear, proud call to a great future. It was a confused, worried, often badly informed jump into the unknown, led by voices that promised a perfect place but gave you something much closer to hell on wheels. All right. So, you've made a very bad choice. You've decided to put your weak body and your easily broken mind into the hands of the Concord stagecoach, which was not known for being gentle. If you thought you were signing up for a fun trip with some time off, you were very, very wrong. The idea of holidays or paid leave would have made a stagecoach driver laugh if he was capable of laughing. For the passenger, these words were like a foreign language no one on the frontier spoke. The only schedule that mattered was the one that kept the coach moving, a schedule set by how long the horses could last, how bad the road was, and the often mean mood of the driver. The road itself, just a rough track cut through the wild land, never took a day off. So, of course, neither did you. There was no calling in sick if you woke up feeling like you'd been run over by a herd of buffalo, which, after a night in the coach, you probably did. The only sick days were the ones where you were too close to death to be physically loaded back onto the coach, and even then, they might try. A normal day, if you can call any day spent in such misery normal, started way before the sun showed its face. You wouldn't be gently woken by a soft knock. More likely, you'd be thrown from your uneasy, pain-filled sleep by the loud noises of the station coming to life, if you were lucky enough to be at one of these so-called stations. These places were often just a couple of dirty, falling-down log cabins or mud huts smelling of old sweat, animal poop, and hopelessness. The air would be cold and damp, and the first feeling you'd have was usually the deep ache in every single bone and muscle from the day before. The driver, probably in a bad mood already, or a grumpy station worker, would yell that the coach was leaving soon. There was no snooze button on the frontier. You moved, or you got left behind. and getting left behind in the middle of nowhere was a really bad idea. The horses, poor things, would be getting hitched up, their own tired bodies a sad sight in the gray light before dawn. Breakfast, if you could call the stuff they gave you that, was a real test of your stomach and your will to live. At a station, you might get coffee. This was usually a bitter black liquid, so strong it could probably wake the dead, or at least make them wish they were still dead. It was often boiled in a dirty pot with water from a nearby creek that likely had things living in it you didn't want to think about. To go with this lovely drink, you might get biscuits. These weren't soft and fluffy. They were hard, dry, and heavy, like rocks made of flour. Some people said they were better for throwing at wolves than for eating. If there was meat, it was usually old, salty pork, fried until it was as tough as a shoe, swimming in grease. Or maybe it was some stringy dried meat that tasted like old leather and took all your strength to chew. You'd eat this wonderful meal quickly, standing up or sitting on a dirty bench, surrounded by the dirt and noise of the station. Your stomach would already be unhappy, partly from hunger and partly from knowing what was coming next. There was no time to enjoy your food, even if it had been enjoyable, which it almost never was. The call to all aboard would come too soon, a death sentence for any hope of a peaceful morning. Then it was time to get back into the rolling box of pain, the coach itself. This was a daily fight, a quiet, desperate push and shove for the best seat, though best just meant slightly less awful. Maybe you'd try for a corner seat, hoping to lean against the side, only to find your head banging against the hardwood with every big bump. Or you'd get stuck in the middle, squeezed between two other unhappy people, sharing their body heat, their smells, and their germs. The air inside, already thick with the lovely perfume of old sweat, dirt, and fear from the day before, would quickly get worse as the new day's load of dust and human misery began to fill it up. The first few hours of the morning, as the coach bumped and shook its way forward, were a special kind of awful. The sounds alone were a concert of suffering, the loud creak of the leather straps that held the coach body, groaning like a dying animal with every move, the deeper groans and sometimes sharp cracks of the wooden frame, making you wonder when the whole thing would just fall apart. The rattle of loose boards, the bang of luggage tied on top, and the constant jarring thump of the iron-rimmed wheels hitting rocks and holes in the so-called road. Each sound was a new way to make your nerves raw and your teeth ache. Even before the sun got high enough to start baking you alive, the cold morning air would cut through your clothes, and the shaking would make every muscle in your body tight with pain. Any hope that today might be a little better than yesterday usually died a quick death in those first few miserable hours. Now let us turn our discerning, if somewhat bloodshot, gaze upon the magnificent pieces of engineering that served as your primary tormentor, and yet with cruel irony, your sole means of conveyance, the stagecoach itself, and its accompanying cast of four-legged martyrs. These were not tools in the sense of a craftsman's trusted implements. These were active agents of suffering, often possessing a malevolent personality. Your trusty Concorde coach, or one of its less celebrated brethren, was essentially a heavy wooden box, perched precariously on leather straps, called thoroughbraces. This revolutionary suspension offered a nauseating, unpredictable wallow rather than any discernible shock absorption, ensuring every bump and rut was transmitted directly to your spine. The coach's frame of oak or hickory, with panels of lighter woods, was reinforced with iron, adding to its immense weight and propensity to bog down, while also providing points for rust and stress fractures to develop. Wheels, fashioned from wood with an iron tire, were spectacularly prone to failure. Spokes could crack, hubs could split, and tires could work loose, leading to terrifying wobbles or complete disintegration. Axles, if not regularly greased with some noxious concoction, could seize or snap, leaving you stranded. The ill-fitting doors rattled, and canvas curtains offered minimal protection, admitting more dust, rain, or snow than they repelled. This mobile box of sorrows seemed to possess a capricious malevolence, appearing to seek out rough ground and breaking down in the most inconvenient and dangerous locations imaginable. And the noble beasts that pulled this chariot of agony, horses or often the even more recalcitrant mules. They were rarely pampered thoroughbreds, but a motley collection of tough, stringy animals, chosen for stamina over grace, their ribs often showing, their hides scarred. Overworked, underfed, poorly shod and watered at infrequent, often contaminated sources, their own misery was palpable. Each animal could possess its own problematic personality. A lead horse terrified of shadows, a mule so stubborn it would simply stop pulling. A horse going lame meant significant delays or the grim necessity of abandoning the poor creature. A spooked team could bolt, leading to a terrifying, uncontrolled runaway, the coach careening wildly. Disaster a terrifyingly real possibility. As for your personal protective equipment, it consisted primarily of whatever clothes you wore, offering about as much protection as a strongly worded suggestion. Your sturdy wool suit or multi-layered dress rapidly transformed into a dust-impregnated, sweat-stained testament to declining hygiene, doing little to cushion blows or resist the elements. Hats flew off, and sturdy boots became instruments of torture in the cramped confines. No clothing of the era was designed for the specific sustained assault of a long-distance stagecoach journey. The coach itself, while ostensibly offering shelter, often became the instrument of injury, the low roof connecting with skulls, hard frames attracting elbows and knees, splintered wood snagging clothes and skin. In a rollover, it transformed into a deadly tumbling trap. Yet, despite this daily catalogue of failures and frustrations, this unholy matrimony of passenger and poorly designed conveyance was your life. You were utterly dependent on this rickety, malevolent box and its long-suffering animal engines. You cursed its every jolt, every breakdown. There was no loving maintenance from your side. You were merely the cargo. This absolute powerlessness bred a unique psychological torment, constant anxiety about what might fail next, simmering resentment, and yet a desperate, fervent hope that the damn thing would just hold together for one more mile. It wasn't respect for the machine, but a grudging acknowledgement that, for now, against all odds, it hadn't quite killed you yet. All right. So our intrepid stagecoach passenger has been rattled, starved, and generally abused. But what of the intimate, internal consequences? The cumulative price exacted upon their physical frame and mental equilibrium? This wasn't just an uncomfortable trip. It was a systematic dismantling of well-being. The body, that resilient yet fragile machine, doesn't endure such sustained abuse without protest. By the time our passenger was a third of the way through, they were likely a walking museum of occupational hazards. The spine would feel less like a support structure, and more like badly aligned bricks being repeatedly struck with a mallet. Chronic back pain, from a dull ache to sharp spasms, was practically a given. Joints, knees, hips, shoulders, elbows, wrists, ankles, transformed into screeching hinges of agony, inflamed by constant jarring and bracing. Arthritis might feel like it was setting in with alarming speed. Hands would be gnarled from gripping, palms calloused, knuckles swollen. Feet, crammed into boots, would ache, swell, and throb. Skin became a patchwork of chafing, rashes, sunburn, and windburn. Minor cuts, easily infected. Eyes assaulted by dust and glare, became bloodshot and inflamed. Dental health suffered immensely. A throbbing toothache on the prairie was a special kind of hell. Premature aging became starkly apparent. Deep lines, hair losing luster, a general weariness settling into the bones. Hernias were not uncommon. But it wasn't just the overt injuries. The environment and privations were prolific distributors of internal afflictions. Dysentery, the bloody flux, contracted from contaminated water or food, was common and feared, its cramps, diarrhea, and dehydration capable of felling the strongest. Fevers of various origins, mountain fever, malaria in some regions, laid people low. Even a common cold could escalate into pneumonia or bronchitis. The incessant inhalation of fine trail dust took a severe toll on the lungs, leading to persistent coughs and vulnerability. Chronic malnutrition and dehydration led to weakness, lethargy, headaches, and a diminished capacity to fight off illness. The pervasive, bone-deep exhaustion was systemic, born of physical stress, inadequate nutrition, and the constant drain of fighting off infections. While the body battled, the mind fought its own desperate war. Chief among the assailants was fear, acute fear of immediate peril, the coach overturning, a runaway team, hostile encounters, fear of breakdown in hostile territory, fear of illness and dying alone, far from home, fear of the unknown ahead. Then there was the sheer, soul-crushing monotony, mile after endless mile of jolting discomfort, the landscape changing with agonizing slowness. Days blurred into a meaningless succession of misery. The lack of meaningful activity, any sense of purpose beyond mere endurance, could lead to profound ennui. A profound lack of agency, a feeling of utter powerlessness also took its toll. The passenger was human cargo, their fate in the hands of others and blind chance. This helplessness could breed deep frustration or debilitating fatalism. Isolation, paradoxically, could be significant even when crammed with others. Shared misery didn't always translate into connection. Passengers were often strangers preoccupied with their own anxieties. The cumulative effect was often an erosion of spirit, a dimming of hope. Coping mechanisms were few: stoic resignation, prayer, furtive sips from a hidden flask, or black humor. But for many, the inner world became a fortress under siege, its walls slowly crumbling. The screaming silence within was the sound of their spirit fighting a desperate, often losing battle to retain some semblance of hope and sanity. Ah, people. Just when our weary wanderer might have momentarily adapted to the peculiar agonies inflicted by the coach itself, or the relentless hostility of the environment, humanity, in its infinite and often infuriating variety, would invariably step forward to prove that it could always make a bad situation demonstrably worse. For travel, especially of the protracted, intimate, and profoundly uncomfortable sort that defined the Stagecoach experience, is rarely a solitary pursuit. No, it is a shared ordeal, a rolling microcosm of society, where one is thrust into unwelcome proximity with a random assortment of souls, each equipped with their own unique and often spectacular capacity to irritate, inconvenience, and generally add new and inventive layers to the already rich tapestry of your despair. The human element, on a journey designed to strip away civility and expose raw nerves, was often the most unpredictable and trying variable of all. Your fellow passengers, for instance, were a lottery of human interaction from which you almost never drew a winning ticket. Or if you did, the prize was usually just a slightly less grating form of annoyance. You might find yourself, for agonizing day after agonizing day, wedged shoulder to sweaty shoulder next to the garrulous Gustav, a man whose internal monologue apparently had no off switch and whose supply of tedious anecdotes, unsolicited opinions on every conceivable subject, from the proper shoeing of mules to the theological implications of a missed meal, and mind-numbingly detailed accounts of his own previous, far less interesting ailments, was as boundless and unvarying as the prairie itself. His voice, a monotonous nasal drone, would fill the cramped confines of the coach, a relentless assault on your eardrums, making focused thought impossible and quiet contemplation a distant, unattainable dream. You'd learn to feign sleep with Oscar-worthy commitment, only to have him nudge you awake to share a particularly fascinating observation about a distant cloud formation. Or perhaps fate, in its infinite cruelty, would seat you opposite petulant Penelope, a woman who seemed to have mistaken the stagecoach for a royal procession, arranged for her personal displeasure. Nothing met her exacting, if entirely delusional, standards. The dust was too dusty, and how dare it settle on her, already filthy valise. The speed of the coach was either too slow, an insult to her urgent and entirely self-important schedule, or too fast, a reckless endangerment of her precious person. The air was too hot, or too cold, or simply not the right kind of air. Her fellow passengers breathed too loudly, occupied too much space she clearly believed was hers by divine right, or simply possessed faces that she found aesthetically offensive. Her constant stream of high-pitched complaints, sighs, and dramatic eye rolls created an atmosphere of perpetual, simmering negativity, a miasma of dissatisfaction that could curdle the already questionable station coffee from 10 paces. Then there was corpulent Carl, a man whose physical dimensions seemed to defy the very engineering principles of the coach. He didn't just occupy his allotted seat, he colonized it, his fleshy overflow expanding like an unstoppable yeast, subtly but inexorably compressing his neighbors into ever smaller, more contorted spaces. The battle for inches of bench became a silent, desperate war of attrition, usually won by Carl through sheer, unyielding mass. His snores, when he inevitably succumbed to slumber, were not mere mortal exhalations but geological events, a rumbling, snorting, whistling symphony that vibrated through the very timbers of the coach and made sleep for anyone else an exercise in wishful thinking. And heaven help you if you were on his leeward side after a particularly challenging station meal. One could not forget the unfortunate presence of sniffling Samuel or sickly Susan, individuals whose journey was accompanied by a percussive orchestra of coughs, sneezes, wheezes, and other alarming expectorations. In the close, unventilated confines of the coach, every moist exhalation felt like a targeted biological attack. You'd find yourself holding your breath, turning away, trying to create an invisible sanitary cordon around yourself, all while desperately hoping their ailment wasn't something contagious, like the consumption they might be fleeing, or the influenza they undoubtedly picked up at the last stop. Their pale faces, their listless demeanor, their air of resigned martyrdom, or sometimes infuriating obliviousness to the discomfort they were causing others, added another layer of grimness to the proceedings. And of course, there was the ever-present know-it-all Nigel, a man whose encyclopedic knowledge of things he had never actually experienced was truly breathtaking. He'd dispense unsolicited advice on everything from the best way to treat a snakebite, usually involving some bizarre and dangerous folk remedy, to the optimal strategy for fending off a band of hostile Cheyenne, gleaned, one suspected, from a particularly lurid dime novel. His pronouncements, delivered with an unshakable, condescending confidence, were not only irritating but potentially dangerous, should any truly desperate soul be foolish enough to heed them. The sheer random misery of being trapped for weeks with such characters was a trial that could test the patience of a saint and the sanity of a philosopher. The employees of the stage line, those dedicated servants of your discomfort, also played their vital part in the grand opera of your suffering. The driver, a figure often romanticized in later, more comfortable eras, was more frequently a grizzled, profane, and profoundly unsociable character, an absolute autocrat of his rolling, lurching kingdom. His primary concern was the horses, and to a lesser extent, the vague notion of adhering to some kind of schedule, however battered by reality. Passenger comfort, passenger input, these were concepts as alien to him as a warm bath or a civil word. Some were men of few words, their disapproval conveyed through stony silences and withering glares. Others were volcanically profane, their interactions with the team, the road, and occasionally a particularly vocal passenger. A rich and unending tapestry of creative cursing that could peel paint. A skilled driver, it was true, could be a godsend, navigating treacherous terrain with a practiced hand, his knowledge of the route the only thing between you and oblivion. But even these skilled individuals were often hardened by the brutality of their own existence, their empathy eroded by endless miles and countless complaining passengers, and a reckless, drunken, or simply incompetent driver. That was a terror that eclipsed almost all others, transforming the journey from a mere exercise in misery into a high-stakes gamble with your own mortality. Then there were the station masters, the lonely, often embittered, lords of the squalid relay stations that punctuated the endless trail. These were men who presided over kingdoms of dirt, flimsy structures, and profound indifference, often isolated for months on end, poorly paid, and supplied with only the most meager of resources. Their enthusiasm for customer service was, shall we say, muted. Information about delays, road conditions, or the availability of anything remotely edible was usually dispensed grudgingly, if at all. Food, when it existed, was slapped down with a thud and a take-it-or-leave-it grunt. Any appeal for an extra blanket, a cleaner corner to sleep in, or a dipper of water that didn't contain visible life forms, was typically met with a vacant stare, a shrug, or a curt dismissal. You were not a valued customer. You were an interruption, another mouth to feed, another body to process before the next coach arrived, disgorging its fresh cargo of misery. Their adherence to company rules, or their own arbitrary interpretation thereof, could lead to endless frustrations, disputes over fares, lost or damaged luggage for which no one took responsibility, or the steadfast refusal to deviate one iota from a nonsensical regulation, even in the face of obvious human suffering. You were a cog, and they were the equally ground-down, resentful gatekeepers of the system. And what of your companions in this rolling purgatory, your fellow sufferers? This unmerry band of brothers and sisters in abject misery. The dynamic within the coach was a complex, ever-shifting dance of human nature under extreme pressure, sometimes in the crucible of a shared, terrifying experience, a near rollover, a dangerous river crossing, the sudden appearance of genuinely threatening figures on the horizon. A fragile, fleeting sense of camaraderie might flicker into existence. A shared, wide-eyed glance that wordlessly communicated, "Well, this is it then." A muttered curse of agreement when the coach hit a particularly vicious pothole. Perhaps even a small, almost imperceptible act of solidarity. Someone subtly shifting to give another a fraction more room. The sharing of a last biscuit. A hushed warning about a loose handhold. Laughter, when it very rarely occurred, was a harsh barking sound. A brief, convulsive release of tension, often at the sheer, overwhelming absurdity of their shared predicament, before the grim reality reasserted itself. But these moments of connection were often as ephemeral as the morning mist. The relentless pressures of hunger, fatigue, fear, and the sheer, unadulterated annoyance of being trapped in suffocatingly close proximity with the same irritating people for weeks on end could swiftly erode any nascent goodwill. Irritation would fester. Silent feuds would erupt over perceived encroachments of precious legroom, a stray elbow, a valise nudged an inch too far. The unspoken rules of the coach, who had dibs on the slightly less drafty corner, whose turn it was to endure the middle seat, the etiquette of leaning on a stranger while attempting to snatch a few moments of jolting unconsciousness, were constantly being negotiated, and often resentfully breached. A grim hierarchy of suffering might even emerge, based on physical strength, perceived social standing, or simply the ability to complain loudest and longest. In the most extreme circumstances, the thin veneer of civilization could strip away entirely, revealing the raw, desperate core of self-preservation. Food might be hoarded, water selfishly guarded. Blame for misfortunes, a delay caused by a sick horse, a missed connection, could be unfairly cast. The desire to secure one's own minimal comfort, however slight, could lead to acts of petty cruelty or indifference to the more acute suffering of others. Yet, even amidst this, the resilience of the human spirit could manifest in surprising ways. A shared, darkly cynical joke about the inedible food or the incompetence of the stage line could serve as a vital defense mechanism, a way of asserting some small measure of agency, of laughing in the face of despair. These were not friendships forged in the crucible, but temporary wary alliances against a common enemy, the journey itself. And upon arrival, these bonds, if they ever truly formed, would usually dissolve as quickly as the trail dust was shaken from their clothes, each passenger eager to escape the memory of their shared ordeal and the unwelcome intimacy it had forced upon them. Right then, our weary wanderer has been physically pummeled, mentally frayed, olfactorily assaulted, and culinarily insulted. But let us not forget another crucial dimension of their suffering, the relentless, grinding attrition exacted upon their financial resources. If you thought the journey was merely an investment in discomfort, you'd be sorely mistaken. It was also, for most passengers, a masterclass in watching one's hard-earned, often desperately hoarded, savings evaporate into the dusty prairie air, exchanged for luxuries and services that would make a modern consumer protection agency spontaneously combust from sheer outrage. The economic realities of stagecoach travel were, in their own quiet, insidious way, as brutal as any physical hardship. Dining aboard your average stage line, or more accurately, at the charmingly rustic, which is to say teetering on the verge of structural collapse and overrun with vermin, way stations, was an experience that redefined the very concept of food. The staple of this gastronomic wasteland was often bread, though to call it such was an act of profound linguistic charity. More often it was a dense, coarse, frequently gritty cake of compacted flour and regret, tasting progressively more like sawdust as the days wore on. Sometimes these biscuits, or hardtack, were so notoriously indestructible they were rumored to have a secondary function as building materials or emergency ballast. A passenger might find themselves gnawing on such an object for an eternity, their jaw aching, their teeth protesting, only to find it yielded little more than a few dusty crumbs and a profound sense of existential despair. And one always had to inspect these baked goods carefully for unwelcome protein in the form of weevils or their larvae, who were presumably fellow, if unpaying, diners. Meat, when it deigned to make an appearance on the station menu, was usually a slab of heavily salted pork or bacon, swimming in a sea of its own congealed grease, its origins best left uninvestigated by the overly curious. This porcine delight, often fried to a consistency somewhere between shoe leather and petrified wood, was valued more for its preservative qualities, thanks to the mountains of salt, than for any discernible flavor or nutritional value. Its primary contribution to the passenger's well-being was often a raging thirst and a lingering case of indigestion. Occasionally, if the station was particularly well provisioned or a local hunter had been fortunate, some stringy, overcooked venison or other unidentifiable game might be on offer, usually tough enough to give your jaw a workout that would last until the next state line. Vegetables were a rare and exotic treat. If you were lucky, you might encounter some boiled potatoes, often cooked to a watery, flavorless mush, or perhaps some sad, translucent onions floating in a greasy stew. Fresh produce? A fantastical dream. Scurvy, while perhaps not rampant on every journey, was certainly a silent, lurking passenger, given the profound lack of vitamin C. The beverages were no less challenging. Coffee, when available, was a heroic brew of astounding bitterness, often concocted more from chicory, burnt grains, and sheer wishful thinking than actual coffee beans. It would be served lukewarm, in a chipped tin cup that likely hadn't seen a proper scrubbing since the last presidential inauguration, and would taste vaguely of disappointment and ancient campfire smoke. Its primary effect was less invigoration and more a scouring of the esophagus. Tea, if offered, was usually a weak, insipid concoction, little more than vaguely colored hot water, and water itself, that most basic elixir of life, was a constant source of anxiety and potential illness. sourced from whatever muddy river, stagnant well, or algae-infested rain barrel was closest to the station. It was often tepid, cloudy, and possessed a fascinating array of unidentifiable floating particles and a distinct earthy, or sometimes metallic tang. Each sip was a gamble with your intestines, a game of bacterial roulette where the house, in the form of dysentery or typhoid, almost always won. Passengers who had the foresight and means might carry their own provisions, some jerky perhaps, or a hunk of hard cheese and some dried fruit. But even these meager stores would be subject to the rigors of the journey, prone to spoilage in the heat, or becoming unappetizingly pulverized by the constant jolting. The act of eating itself was often a rushed, uncomfortable affair, conducted with grimy hands, perched on a rough bench or a tree stump amidst the general chaos and squalor of the station. There was little joy in such sustenance. It was merely fuel, and poor quality fuel at that, barely adequate to keep the human engine from sputtering to a complete halt. And your sleeping quarters? Oh, prepare for an invitation to the land of Nod, delivered via a series of violent jolts, unwelcome intimacies, and the constant, gnawing suspicion that something was crawling on you. If the stagecoach traveled through the night, which it often did to maintain its brutal schedule, then your bed was the coach itself. This meant attempting to achieve unconsciousness while sitting bolt upright, or perhaps slumped at an impossible angle against a fellow passenger who was, in all likelihood, equally odorous and uncomfortable. Your neck would develop a permanent, agonizing crick from your head lolling about like a broken puppet's. Your limbs, with nowhere to stretch, would alternate between throbbing agony and a disconcerting numbness. Every lurch and bump of the coach was a personal summons back to wakefulness, often accompanied by your head making forceful, painful contact with the unyielding wooden frame or the equally unyielding skull of your neighbor. The atmosphere within the coach at night was a concentrated essence of misery, the cold draft seeping through the ill-fitting curtains, the symphony of snores, coughs, and groans from your fellow sufferers, the intensified aromas of unwashed bodies and stale air, and the unsettling noises from the dark wilderness outside. Should the schedule allow for a stop at a designated hotel or relay station, the term questionable shelter would be doing some exceptionally heavy lifting. Your 5-star accommodation for the night might consist of a single, large, low-ceilinged room in a log cabin or sod house, its floor often packed earth, its walls chinked with mud that did little to keep out the wind or the cold, its roof prone to leaking with every shower. In this communal space, all passengers, regardless of age, gender, or standards of personal hygiene, were expected to bed down together like so many sardines, in a particularly unsavory, flea-ridden can. Sometimes there were rough-hewn bunks, perhaps stacked 3 high, often constructed from green wood that oozed sap. More often it was a shared bed, a wide pallet or mattress filled with lumpy straw or corn husks, where you might find yourself spooning intimately with several complete strangers, whose nocturnal habits could range from thunderous, building-shaking snoring and violent, unconscious twitching to bouts of feverish muttering or sudden, explosive flatulence. Privacy was a concept as alien and unattainable as a hot bath. The bedding itself, when provided, was a source of further torment. Blankets were typically thin, scratchy, and bore the greasy, sweat-stained historical record of every previous occupant's bodily fluids, dreams, and itinerant vermin. Lice, fleas, and the dreaded bedbugs were not so much occasional pests as they were resident staff, always eager to welcome a fresh smorgasbord of unwitting blood donors. You'd spend the night in a state of constant, itchy vigilance, feeling imaginary, and often all too real, things crawling upon your skin. The air in these establishments would be thick with the aroma of unwashed bodies, stale tobacco smoke, spilled liquor, ancient cooking smells, and the subtle but pervasive scent of mildew and rodent droppings. You didn't so much sleep in such places as you surrendered to a state of fitful, anxious semi-consciousness, waking more exhausted, more bitten, and more profoundly dispirited than when you had lain down. The psychological impact of such shelter was one of gradual degradation, a wearing down of one's sense of dignity, a constant, nagging longing for the simple decencies of cleanliness and comfort. The very notion that night, or any period designated for rest, was for uninterrupted, restorative sleep was a charming fairy tale, best told to pampered city children who had never known the inside of a frontier stage station. Even if you managed, through some miracle of contortion and exhaustion, to wedge yourself into a position within the coach, or on a station floor that didn't immediately threaten to dislocate a major joint or suffocate you with someone else's armpit, there were a plethora of other diversions specifically designed to ensure that true slumber remained an elusive, mythical creature. The constant, unpredictable motion of the coach, as we've established, made deep sleep an impossibility. You might drift off, only to be slammed back to aching consciousness by a wheel hitting a rock, or the driver yelling at the team, or a fellow passenger groaning in their sleep. Even when the coach mercifully halted at a relay station, rest was a fugitive. These stops, often occurring at ungodly hours of the night, were scenes of frantic activity. The noise and commotion of unharnessing the tired team and harnessing a fresh one. The shouting of the ostlers, the arrival and departure of other coaches or freight wagons, all conspired to keep sleep at bay. Passengers might be required to disembark, even in the freezing cold or pouring rain, while the horses were changed, or while some minor repair was being effected on the coach. You'd have to remain vaguely alert, lest you be left behind in the confusion, or have your meager baggage pilfered by opportunistic thieves. Beyond the external disturbances, your own body often became your worst enemy in the quest for sleep. The agonizing throb of your protesting muscles, the relentless ache in your back and joints, the burning itch of insect bites, the gnawing pangs of hunger, or the urgent call of a distended bladder, with the next facility, a generous term for a slit trench or a clump of bushes, miles away. All these physical discomforts made deep, restorative slumber a distant dream. Anxiety, too, was a potent insomnia inducer. The fear of accidents, of breakdowns, of illness, of what unknown perils the next day might bring, all churning in your mind, keeping you wired and wary. The cumulative effect of this chronic sleep deprivation was devastating. Physically, it led to impaired coordination, slowed reflexes, a dangerous handicap in a precarious environment, and a severely weakened immune system, making you more susceptible to the myriad diseases that lurked along the trail. Mentally, it manifested as profound irritability, poor judgment, an inability to concentrate, memory lapses, and extreme emotional instability. You might find yourself snapping at fellow passengers over the slightest provocation, or weeping from sheer exhaustion and despair. In extreme, prolonged cases, it could even lead to a sort of waking delirium, where the line between the miserable reality and a fevered dream began to blur. You were trapped in a perpetual state of groggy, aching, nerve-jangling exhaustion, your body and mind crying out for a rest that the journey relentlessly, cruelly denied. Let's begin with the fare itself, the initial price of admission to this rolling theater of torment. A ticket on a Concord stagecoach for a journey of any significant distance, say, from the Missouri River to the goldfields of California or the fertile valleys of Oregon, was not a trivial expense. For a working man, it could represent many months, even a full year or more, of hard labor. For a family, it might mean liquidating all their worldly possessions, selling the farm, cashing in every last hope and dream for a fistful of paper that promised passage, but guaranteed little else. This wasn't the equivalent of booking a budget flight. This was a life-altering financial commitment, often undertaken with a sense of grim determination, the knowledge that there was no turning back once that considerable sum had been handed over. The weight of that investment, the sheer proportion of their worldly wealth it represented, added another layer of anxiety to the already overburdened passenger's psyche. Every jolt, every delay, every discomfort was not just a physical affront. but a galling reminder of the exorbitant price they had paid for this privilege. And what did this hefty sum actually purchase? The illusion, perhaps, of an all-inclusive passage to a brighter future. The reality was far more mercenary. The ticket generally covered your cramped space within the coach and the movement of your person, and a very limited amount of baggage, with excess charges often being ruinous, from one point to another, assuming the coach, horses, and driver all held out. Beyond that, you were largely on your own, a captive consumer in a seller's market where the sellers held all the cards, and a near monopoly on your survival. The way stations, those squalid little outposts of civilization we've already visited in our nightmares, were not just havens of dubious shelter and inedible food. They were also highly efficient mechanisms for extracting further tribute from the beleaguered traveler. Those meals, the ones that tasted of despair and were cooked with contempt, they were rarely included in your fare. That greasy slab of salt pork, those flinty biscuits, that cup of alleged coffee. Each item would be priced at a level that bore no relation to its quality or cost of production, but was instead dictated by the simple fact that you were miles from any alternative, starving and desperate. You paid or you went without, and going without for too long on such an arduous journey was simply not an option. The station master, often a man whose hospitality was as barren as the landscape surrounding him, knew this well, and his pricing reflected this captive audience reality. The same applied to lodging. If the stage stopped for the night at a station that offered something beyond a patch of dirt floor to collapse upon, perhaps a flea-ridden bunk, or a share of a lumpy, straw-filled mattress already well populated by previous occupants and their attendant entomological companions, you could be sure there was a charge for such luxury. Need an extra blanket against the biting prairie wind that whistled through the chinks in the log walls. That, too, might appear as an additional item on your rapidly dwindling account. If the coach had to cross a river on a private ferry, or a bridge maintained by some enterprising individual, the toll was often passed directly onto the passengers. These weren't vast sums individually, perhaps, but they accumulated with the depressing regularity of water dripping on a stone, each small expense a further erosion of your precious travel fund. Then there was the ever-present risk of loss or theft. In the chaotic, crowded conditions of the coach and the stations, with passengers constantly coming and going, their baggage piled haphazardly, opportunities for petty thievery abounded. A moment's inattention, a nap taken at the wrong time, and a small valise containing vital funds or irreplaceable personal items could vanish, with little hope of recovery and even less sympathy from the stage line. And this doesn't even touch upon the more dramatic, if less frequent possibility of an encounter with highwaymen, gentlemen of the road, who viewed the stagecoach and its occupants as a convenient mobile repository of portable wealth. While perhaps romanticized in fiction, an actual robbery was a terrifying and potentially impoverishing experience. Any funds you had managed to protect from the station masters might be summarily surrendered at gunpoint. The cost of delays, too, fell squarely upon the passenger. If the coach broke down due to a snapped axle or a foundered wheel, common occurrences, and repairs took several days, you were responsible for your own keep during that unscheduled hiatus. If you were fortunate enough to be stranded near a station, you'd pay their inflated prices. If not, you'd be subsisting on whatever meager provisions you carried, or going hungry, while your schedule, and perhaps your prospects at your destination, slipped further away. The stage company offered no refunds for lost time, no compensation for missed connections or spoiled plans. Their obligation ended with eventually, theoretically, getting your body from point A to point B. And what of the value you, the passenger, received in return for this considerable financial and personal investment? From the perspective of the stagecoach company, you were, once your fare was secured, essentially self-loading cargo. Your comfort, your well-being, even your safety beyond the bare minimum required to avoid a truly scandalous loss of life that might attract unwanted official attention, were often distant secondary concerns. The mail contracts, those lucrative government agreements to transport letters and official documents, were frequently the real financial backbone of the stage lines. The mail didn't complain about the food, or the jolting, or the fleas. It didn't require extra blankets or demand refunds. Passengers, with their endless needs and tiresome grievances, were often viewed as a necessary but irritating adjunct to the more profitable business of mail transport. "Thanks for nothing" might well have been the unspoken motto of many a stage line when it came to customer service. Complaints about the conditions were usually met with indifference, a shrug, or the implied suggestion that if you didn't like it, you were free to get out and walk. An option that, in the middle of a hostile wilderness, was no option at all. There was a profound and bitter irony in the fact that many passengers were undertaking this financially ruinous journey precisely in order to seek their fortune. They were headed west with dreams of gold nuggets, fertile homesteads, or successful new businesses, only to find that the journey itself was a highly efficient mechanism for stripping them of whatever meager capital they possessed before they even had a chance to glimpse their El Dorado. The stage lines, in this sense, acted as a brutal economic filter. Those who arrived at their destination with anything left in their pockets were either exceptionally lucky, remarkably frugal, or had started with considerably more resources than the average traveler. For many, the dream of wealth accumulation began with an object lesson in wealth depletion, courtesy of the very vehicle that was supposed to carry them to prosperity. The transaction was starkly one-sided. You paid your money, you took your chances, and you endured. There were no guarantees of arrival time, no refunds for appalling service, no compensation for the physical and mental toll. You were simply a unit of revenue, a body occupying a space to be conveyed with as little outlay from the company as possible. The wider world, with its wars, its economic fevers, and its unpredictable natural events, also had a nasty habit of inserting itself into the passengers' financial woes, often twisting the knife of economic hardship just a little deeper. Consider the impact of a gold rush. News of a strike in California, Colorado, or Montana would send waves of hopefuls surging westward, and the stage lines, never slow to capitalize on human desperation, would respond by immediately jacking up their fares to astronomical levels. Coaches would be dangerously overcrowded. The already abysmal quality of food and lodging at stations would plummet further as demand outstripped supply. And every grifter and price gouger on the continent would descend upon the routes to fleece the naive. Your carefully calculated travel budget could be rendered laughably inadequate overnight. Conflicts with Native American tribes along the routes, often exacerbated by the relentless westward pressure of which the stagecoaches were a key component, would also have dire financial consequences for the passenger. Increased danger might lead to the necessity of military escorts, which invariably slowed the journey and added to its cost. Routes might be changed or suspended entirely, leaving passengers stranded for weeks or months in some forlorn frontier outpost, their funds dwindling as they waited for the Indian troubles to subside. The stage lines themselves might levy a risk premium on fares, passing the cost of potential danger and their own increased insurance or security expenses directly onto the already burdened traveler. Economic panics or depressions back east, like the Panic of 1857, could have devastating ripple effects. A passenger might embark on their journey with what they believed to be sufficient funds, only to learn weeks later that the bank holding their savings had collapsed, rendering their letters of credit worthless. Or the job they were traveling to, the opportunity that had lured them west, might have vanished in a puff of economic smoke. The stage lines, too, could suffer in such downturns, leading to reduced service, bankruptcies that left passengers stranded mid-journey, or even more desperate attempts to squeeze every last cent from those still able to travel. And then there was the weather, that implacable, unpredictable force. A particularly severe winter could render mountain passes impassable for months, trapping passengers in isolated settlements where the cost of living would skyrocket as supplies dwindled. Spring floods could wash out roads and bridges, turning straightforward routes into navigational nightmares and necessitating long, costly detours, often with opportunistic locals charging exorbitant fees to ferry passengers and coaches across swollen rivers. Prairie fires could devastate vast swathes of land, destroying grazing for the horses and making travel through the smoke-choked landscape a dangerous, suffocating ordeal, again leading to delays and increased expenses. Each delay, each unforeseen calamity, was not just a trial of endurance, but a direct assault on the passenger's rapidly diminishing purse, a constant gnawing anxiety that underscored the precariousness of their entire venture. The economic journey was, in its own way, as perilous and unpredictable as the physical one. If our beleaguered stagecoach passenger entertained any naive notions that their journey would be a neatly compartmentalized affair, a series of discrete challenges to be ticked off a list leading to a triumphant conclusion, they were in for a rude and exceptionally protracted awakening. The journey west by stagecoach was less a linear progression and more an immersion into a seemingly infinite, Sisyphean cycle of suffering, a relentless Mobius strip of discomfort where every apparent ending was merely the prelude to a new and inventive form of torment. The concept of arrival became a distant, almost mythical abstraction, while the grinding, repetitive present consumed all. The very idea of making progress was a cruel joke played by the vast, indifferent landscape. You might spend days, even weeks, toiling across a seemingly featureless prairie, the horizon an unyielding, taunting line that never seemed to get any closer. Then, perhaps, a distant smudge would resolve itself into a range of forbidding mountains. With Herculean effort from the straining horses and no small amount of terror from the passengers, this obstacle would eventually be surmounted, each ascent a lung-busting agony, each descent a white-knuckle flirtation with oblivion. And what was your reward for conquering this colossal barrier? The privilege of gazing out upon another vast, featureless plain, or perhaps a sun-baked desert stretching to infinity, promising a whole new repertoire of heat, thirst, and desolation. Major rivers were crossed, often with heart-stopping peril, only to reveal yet more country to be traversed on the other side, equally dusty, equally devoid of comfort. Each apparent milestone, each conquered segment of the trail, offered no genuine respite, no satisfying sense of accomplishment. It merely reset the clock on your suffering, delivering you, bruised and battered, to the starting line of the next grueling leg. The to-do list in your mind, if you still possess the clarity for such organized thought, would simply read, endure, survive the current jolt, breathe through the next cloud of dust, ignore the gnawing hunger, repeat, ad infinitum, until you either arrive or expire. It was a journey where fixing one problem, say, a broken wheel painstakingly repaired by the driver under a blazing sun, almost invariably led to another. The delay causing you to miss a connection, or forcing you into night travel through dangerous territory. The monotony of this suffering was a potent psychological corrosive. Day after identical day would dawn with the same cold dread, the same aching limbs, the same grim prospect of hours upon hours of jolting confinement. The landscape, even when it changed, often did so with an agonizing slowness, the subtle shifts in vegetation or terrain too gradual to offer any real distraction from your internal chorus of discomforts. Time itself seemed to warp and distend, hours stretching into eternities, weeks blurring into an undifferentiated mass of misery. You might lose track of what day it was, what month, even what season it was supposed to be in the world beyond the dusty confines of your rolling prison. The relay stations, those squalid little punctuation marks in the endless sentence of your journey, were not true endings or beginnings. They were frantic, uncomfortable interludes, brief pauses in the rhythm of torment, where exhausted horses were swapped for slightly less exhausted ones, where a mouthful of wretched food might be choked down, before you were once again herded back into the coach to resume the endless forward grind. There was a palpable feeling of being trapped on a poorly maintained treadmill of torment, each step agonizing, leading nowhere pleasant, offering no hope of a genuine finish line. Only the grim, repetitive mechanics of continued suffering. It was a journey that felt less like a passage through space and more like a sentence to be served, with no clear parole date. And this sense of endlessness was compounded by the inescapable nature of your predicament. Once you had committed your fare, your belongings, and your very person to the stage line, you were, for all practical purposes, a prisoner of the journey. The thought of turning back, of simply saying, "Enough, I can endure no more of this," might flicker through your exhausted mind like a brief, rebellious spark. But where would you go? How would you get there? The fare was spent, your bridges back east likely burned. To attempt a solo return journey through the vast, unpopulated, and often dangerous territory you had just traversed was often a far more perilous proposition than pressing onward into the known misery that lay ahead. There was the shame of failure, the ignominy of retreat, the crushing weight of admitting that the dream which had propelled you thus far was a hollow illusion. You were trapped by the indifferent machinery of the stage line itself. Its erratic schedule was your schedule. Its chosen route, however illogical or dangerous it might seem, was your route. You were a tiny, insignificant cog in the great, creaking, groaning machine of westward expansion. Your individual desires, your desperate need for rest or comfort, utterly irrelevant to its relentless, forward momentum. The sheer scale of the American West contributed to this feeling of imprisonment. Days, sometimes weeks, could pass without seeing anything resembling a significant settlement. Only the endless expanse of prairie, mountain, or desert. A landscape so vast and indifferent it could make you feel terrifyingly small, a helpless speck adrift in an ocean of wilderness. There was no pulling over for a scenic break if a particular vista struck your fancy, though fancy was a luxury few passengers could afford. There was no deciding to spend an extra day in a marginally less awful spot to recuperate. You went where the stage went, when the stage went, at the pace the stage dictated, bound by invisible tethers of financial commitment, logistical impossibility, and a grim, forward-leaning inertia. The only way out, it seemed, was through, however long and however agonizing that through might prove to be. Yet even in this profound and comprehensive ocean of suffering, the human spirit, that stubborn, often irrational spark of defiance, would occasionally find tiny, improbable islands of something other than pure misery. It would be a grotesque insult to the passenger's ordeal to suggest these moments constituted joy or happiness in any conventional sense. They were more like finding a single, slightly less rotten berry in a bowl full of mold, or a brief cessation of a thumbscrew's pressure, not pleasure, but a momentary, almost shocking, absence of acute pain, a fleeting affirmation of existence in a world seemingly dedicated to crushing it. These were the fleas of grim satisfaction, discovered amidst the mange-ridden pelt of their daily reality, the 20% that made the 80% suck stand out in even starker relief. Sometimes, a moment of unexpected, almost reluctant human connection would pierce the gloom. Perhaps after a particularly violent series of jolts that sent everyone tumbling into an undignified heap, a shared, exasperated glance would pass between you and a fellow sufferer, a silent acknowledgement of the sheer absurdity of it all. Maybe a dark, cynical joke about the inedibility of the station food, or the driver's spectacularly profane vocabulary, would elicit a dry chuckle from someone nearby. A brief, shared laugh that was less about humor and more about a collective, weary defiance. A small, almost unconscious act of kindness. Someone subtly shifting to give you an extra inch of space, an offer of a swig from a canteen of, hopefully, clean water when your own was long gone, a commiserating nod when you let out an involuntary groan of pain. These tiny gestures could feel disproportionately significant, a reminder that even in this rolling hell, a flicker of shared humanity might still exist. Rarely, very rarely, the environment itself, that relentless antagonist, might offer a moment of unintended grace, a sunrise over the prairie, so vast and breathtakingly beautiful in its palette of soft pinks and golds that it momentarily silenced the complaints of your aching body. The sudden awe-inspiring vista from a mountain pass, revealing range upon snowy range receding into the blue distance. A sight of such majestic grandeur it could make you forget, for a precious few seconds, your fear and your discomfort. The taste of water from a clear, cold mountain spring, so pure and sweet after days of choking down alkaline, muddy slush. It felt like a divine elixir. Or the sight of a vast herd of bison, 1,000 strong, flowing like a dark, living river across the plains. A spectacle of such raw, untamed power that it could briefly jolt you out of your own personal mire of misery and connect you to something ancient and profound. These were not moments of comfort, but of awe, perhaps even a touch of the badass, witnessing the untamed immensity of a continent and surviving to tell the tale, even if only to yourself. There was also a grim satisfaction to be found in sheer endurance, successfully fording a raging river that had threatened to swallow the coach whole, or navigating a treacherous mountain descent without plunging into the abyss, or simply arriving at any station, however squalid, after a particularly brutal, non-stop stretch of travel. These were small victories, not over an enemy, but over the ever-present possibility of annihilation. You wouldn't cheer, you wouldn't celebrate. You would simply exhale, a shaky internal acknowledgement that you were, against all odds, still alive, still moving, still somehow functioning. This wasn't happiness. It was the gritty, bitter taste of survival, a tiny, defiant affirmation of your own stubborn refusal to be entirely broken. These fleeting moments, these fleas of joy, did not negate the overwhelming suck of the journey. Instead, they were the exceptions that proved the rule, tiny pinpricks of light in an otherwise vast and suffocating darkness, serving only to highlight the profound depth of the shadows from which they briefly, almost miraculously, emerged. The stagecoach journey, that protracted exercise in systematic human degradation, did not simply end when the battered passenger finally stumbled, blinking and disoriented, from its confines at their long dreamed of, and likely profoundly underwhelming destination. Oh no. The journey, like a persistent and unwelcome ghost, often lingered, casting a long, cold shadow over the remainder of their days. And with a particularly cruel irony, it sometimes demanded that its survivors bear witness to, or even become reluctant accomplices in, the perpetuation of its misery upon a fresh generation of hopeful, naive souls. The torch, it seemed, was not always one of enlightenment or progress. Sometimes it was merely a flickering, guttering flame illuminating the path to yet more suffering, passed from one weary hand to the next. Imagine our passenger, years after their own Dantean descent into the hell of cross-country stage travel. They have, perhaps, carved out some semblance of a life in the raw, unforgiving West. The calluses on their hands might now come from an axe handle or a plow, not just from desperately gripping the sides of a lurching coach. The dust in their lungs might be from their own parched fields, rather than the collective effluvia of a dozen different states. The memories of the journey, though seared into their soul, may have receded from the forefront of their daily consciousness, replaced by the more immediate struggles of frontier existence. And then, one day, a letter arrives from back east, smudged with unfamiliar postmarks. Or perhaps a fresh-faced youth appears on their doorstep. A son now grown, a younger sibling with restless feet, a nephew nursing ambitions, or even just the child of an old acquaintance, their eyes bright with that same dangerous, ill-informed sparkle of Western fever that once infected our traveler. They speak, with breathless enthusiasm, of making the journey, of seeking their own fortune, of answering the irresistible call of the frontier. What then goes through the mind of our seasoned survivor? A cold dread, certainly. A visceral, almost physical reliving of their own past torments, the bone-jarring jolts, the choking dust, the gnawing hunger, the terror in the night, the faces of fellow sufferers contorted in misery. The urge to grab this bright-eyed innocent by the shoulders, to shake them, to scream a warning so potent it would scour the romantic notions from their very soul, must have been immense. "Don't do it, you fool," they might want to cry. It's not adventure. It's a slow, grinding descent into a special kind of hell. The pamphlets lie. The stories are gilded falsehoods. You will ache in places you didn't know you had. You will eat food fit only for pigs and be grateful for it. You will question your sanity, your God, and the very decision that led you to this pass. But how to convey such a truth? How to articulate a suffering so profound, so multifaceted, that words seem to pale and shrink before it? Their own family, their own friends back east, might have dismissed their earlier, more immediate letters of complaint as exaggeration, as the grumblings of someone ill-suited to the rigors of pioneering. The great relentless propaganda machine of westward expansion, with its tales of boundless opportunity and heroic triumph, was a powerful counter-narrative. To speak too harshly of the journey might be seen as weakness, as a lack of fortitude, as an attempt to hoard the largely imaginary riches of the West for oneself. The young hopeful, brimming with the unshakable confidence of those who have never truly faced adversity, might listen with polite impatience, their eyes already fixed on a distant, glittering horizon, their ears deaf to the warnings of a past they cannot comprehend. "It won't be like that for me," they might think. "I'm stronger, luckier, smarter." And so the teaching process, the passing of this bitter torch, was often a fraught and unsatisfactory affair. Our veteran passenger might try, perhaps with a haunted look in their eye that spoke more eloquently than any words, or a bitter, mirthless laugh accompanying a carefully chosen anecdote of some particularly horrific incident. "Remember that river crossing I told you about? The one where the coach nearly went over and we lost all the baggage on top? That was a Tuesday, and it wasn't even the worst Tuesday of that month. Or that station coffee? I reckon they brewed it with rusty nails and despair, and charged us a dime a cup for the privilege." The warnings might be couched in dry understatement, the sarcasm a shield against the raw emotion of the memory. But the youth, eager and impatient, might only hear the adventure in the tale, not the lingering trauma. They might even romanticize the hardship, seeing it as a necessary crucible, a proving ground for their own heroic destiny. There was also the grim internal conflict if our passenger had, against all odds, achieved some measure of success in the West. Perhaps their farm prospered, or their small business thrived. How then to reconcile their own hard-won but undeniable gains with the knowledge of the inferno one had to pass through to reach them? Did the end justify the means? Could they, in good conscience, encourage a loved one to endure such an ordeal, even if a similar, though by no means guaranteed, reward lay at the end? For some, the answer was a reluctant yes, a belief that the promise of the West, however tarnished by the journey, was still worth the gamble. For others, it was a source of profound guilt, knowing they were, in a sense, sanctioning the future suffering of someone they cared for. And so, they might offer practical advice. What little to pack, the wisdom of sewing your money into your undershirt, a warning about a particularly notorious stretch of road, or a thieving station master, but the true, visceral warning, the one that screamed from the depths of their own scarred memory, often went unheeded, or was simply untranslatable. The stagecoaches, perhaps marginally improved over the decades, perhaps still the same rolling boxes of damnation, would continue their inexorable crawl across the continent, filled with fresh generations of hopefuls, each one destined to learn the lessons of the trail in their own flesh and blood. And what of our original passenger's own flesh and blood, the body that had borne the brunt of that initial brutal passage. The journey, like a cruel moneylender, always collected its debts, often with usurious interest, long after the final fare had been paid. The physical toll was not a temporary inconvenience that vanished with a few good nights' sleep, as if such a thing were even possible upon arrival. It was often a legacy of chronic ailments, of weakened constitutions, of a premature and unforgiving decline. The inevitable grinding halt didn't necessarily arrive with the gentle snows of old age. It often began its insidious approach much earlier, a slow, creaking surrender of a body pushed far beyond its intended limits. That back, which had been so mercilessly pummeled against the hard wooden seats of the coach, might never truly recover. It would become a lifelong companion of pain, a dull ache that flared into sharp agony with every stoop to lift a child, every swing of an axe, every planting season on the unforgiving frontier soil. The farmer, gazing out over his hard-won acres, would feel not just the honest fatigue of a day's labor, but the ghostly imprint of 10,000 stagecoach jolts, a constant reminder that his foundation was built on compromised sinew and protesting vertebrae. Those joints, inflamed and abused on the trail, might develop into crippling arthritis, making the simple acts of dressing, walking, or holding a tool an exercise in excruciating perseverance. The lungs, which had inhaled a continent's worth of dust, fine, abrasive particles of earth, alkali, dried animal waste, and God knows what else, might develop a persistent, hacking cough, the prairie consumption, or the miner's complaint, a constant breathlessness that made the thin, clear air of the high country feel like a suffocating blanket. This chronic respiratory weakness would leave them vulnerable to every passing cold, every seasonal ague, turning minor illnesses into potentially life-threatening events. The digestive system, so long assaulted by questionable food and contaminated water, might remain a source of chronic discomfort, indigestion, nervous stomach, a persistent unease that robbed them of the simple pleasure of a meal, even when good food was finally available. The mental scars, too, could manifest in profoundly physical ways. The constant anxiety, the terrors endured, the sheer, unrelenting stress of the journey could settle into the nervous system as a permanent tremor, a debilitating fatigue that no amount of rest could cure, or a host of psychosomatic aches and pains for which doctors of the era had no name and no remedy. The slow, painful realization of this accelerated obsolescence, this betrayal by their own body in the very land they had suffered so much to reach, was perhaps one of the bitterest pills to swallow. They had survived the journey, yes, but had they arrived too broken, too depleted, to truly seize the opportunities that the West was supposed to offer? The dream of a robust, independent life on the frontier could curdle into a grim reality of physical limitation and dependence. And in that raw, demanding society, there was little room for the infirm, the prematurely aged, the physically compromised. There were no pensions for retired stagecoach survivors, no social safety nets for those whose bodies had been broken on the westward wheel. If you couldn't work, if your aching back or failing lungs prevented you from contributing your share of the relentless labor required to build a home, a farm, a community from scratch, you risked becoming a burden. Families, bound by ties of love and duty, would care for their own as best they could. But in a world where sheer survival was often a daily struggle for everyone, an ailing relative was another mouth to feed, another worry in a life already overflowing with hardship. The vast, indifferent frontier, much like the stagecoach lines that fed it, had little sentiment for those who could no longer keep pace. The journey's end was not always a new beginning, but sometimes merely the start of a long, slow fade into pain, obscurity, and the bitter knowledge that the price of passage had been far, far too high. And so, after the dust has theoretically settled, after the last jolt has echoed into silence, after the aches have become a chronic familiar companion, what remains of our stagecoach passenger in the grand, often misleading tapestry of history? what is their final, enduring legacy? If you search for statues erected in their honor, for stirring odes celebrating their specific brand of intestinal fortitude, for plaques commemorating their daily, hourly suffering, you will, by and large, find nothing but the sighing of the prairie wind and the vast, indifferent silence of the landscapes they traversed. The average passenger, the one who endured the filth, the fear, the hunger, and the mind-numbing tedium, is a ghost in the historical record. Their name perhaps a forgotten entry on a faded manifest. Their individual story dissolved like a footprint in a dust storm. While the generals who fought the wars, the politicians who signed the treaties, the railroad magnates who eventually, and with considerably more comfort for their passengers, spanned the continent, have their likenesses carved in stone and their deeds floridly recorded in leather-bound volumes, the ordinary human being who simply got on the damn stagecoach and somehow survived to tell the tale, or more often didn't, remains a largely unacknowledged, uncelebrated footnote. Yet, their importance, their crucial, if quiet, role in the epic drama of westward expansion is as undeniable as the ruts they helped to wear into the stubborn face of the earth. They were the ants beneath the obelisk, the countless anonymous individuals whose collective, agonizing effort formed the very foundation upon which the grand structures of a new society were built. Consider the sheer, unglamorous reality. Without their willingness to pay the exorbitant fares, to endure the appalling conditions, to risk life and limb on a conveyance that often seemed actively hostile to their survival, the peopling of the American West would have been a far slower, more tentative, perhaps even an entirely different affair. Each passenger, however insignificant their personal reasons for travel might have seemed, was a tiny, vital thread in the vast, complex weave of migration. They were the human grit in the gears of manifest destiny, often ground down by the process, but essential for its ponderous, relentless movement. They created the initial critical demand for services, however rudimentary, along the desolate trails. Their presence, their sheer, stubborn numerosity, was a constant pressure, a demographic imperative that pushed the boundaries of settlement ever further into the unknown. The grand pronouncements of politicians and the ambitious schemes of entrepreneurs would have remained mere hollow words and blueprint dreams without the unrecorded sweat, the uncomplaining, or vociferously complaining but still enduring, resilience, and the often unmourned sacrifices of these anonymous travelers. The towering cities, the fertile farmlands, the sprawling ranches of the West did not spring fully formed from the brow of some heroic pioneer. They rose, slowly and painfully, upon a substrate of countless forgotten journeys, each one a testament to the human capacity for hope, desperation, and an almost unbelievable tolerance for prolonged misery. The lasting, though often invisible impact of these individual odysseys is etched into the very landscape and character of the nation. While their specific names have long since been lost to the winds, their collective endeavor is embedded in the achievements and the very continuity of American civilization as it lurched and sprawled its way across a continent. What did they make possible? These unsung sufferers. They made possible the towns and cities that eventually dotted the plains and nestled in the mountain valleys. For their passages, however transient, created the nodes around which settlements could coalesce. They brought with them not just their meager belongings, but their languages, their customs, however battered and trail-worn, their skills, their diseases, and their indomitable, if frequently misguided belief in a better future somewhere over the next horizon. They were the anonymous current in the great, muddy, often turbulent river of history, the individual droplets of humanity whose combined flow carved new channels across the land, diverting the course of lives, cultures, and ecosystems. They didn't just witness history from a particularly uncomfortable and poorly sprung vantage point. They physically moved it, inch by agonizing, dust-choked inch, with their own aching bodies and frayed nerves. Their willingness to undertake such a journey, despite its well-documented, even then, through word of mouth and grim reputation horrors, demonstrated that the continent, for all its vastness and peril, could be crossed, that communities could be established in its remotest corners. This psychological victory, this triumph of stubborn human persistence over geographical and logistical immensity, was as significant as any military conquest or technological breakthrough. So, as we draw this particular chronicle of woe to a close, let us spare a final thought for this forgotten figure, the stagecoach passenger. They were not, in the main, heroes in the traditional flag-waving sense. They sought no glory and by and large received none. Their journey was less an epic of daring conquest and more a brutal, protracted siege laid against their own physical and mental fortitude. Yet, in their unceasing, monotonous labor of simply continuing, in their stubborn endurance against conditions that would make a modern traveler weep for their noise-canceling headphones and complimentary beverage service, they were far more than just passive victims, more than just unfortunate sufferers buffeted by the winds of fate and the inadequacies of 19th century transportation. They were a fundamental, indispensable part of the great, unseen, often unacknowledged engine that powered a civilization's relentless drive westward. Their fares, scraped together from hard labor or desperate hope, helped to fund the stage lines. However exploitative those lines might have been, their demand for passage, however miserably accommodated, pushed inch by agonizing inch for the eventual, though agonizingly slow, improvement of routes and conveyances. Their very bodies, enduring the punishment of those primitive trails, were, in a grimly literal sense, helping to pave the way for the smoother, faster journeys of future generations. They were not just a drop in the vast ocean of prairie dust, nor merely a speck tossed about by the turbulent waves of frontier expansion. They were, each in their own small, often desperate way, a tiny spark, a spark of hope for a new life, a spark of fear fleeing an old one, a spark of ambition, or perhaps just the dull, stubborn spark of a will to survive. And these countless anonymous sparks, taken together, ignited the vast, often uncontrolled, and morally ambiguous conflagration of westward movement. Their individual names are forgotten, consigned to the unread ledgers of long-defunct companies, or the crumbling headstones of trailside graves. But their collective contribution, their shared ordeal, their incredible, terrible feat of human endurance, is an indelible, if often unread, chapter in the complex and contradictory story of a nation. They didn't just travel the road. In a very real and painful sense, they were the road. Their passage paid for, not just in coin, but in hardship, in resilience, and in the quiet sacrifice of their own well-being on the altar of a relentless, continent-spanning dream. May we remember them, not as pitiful figures, but as vital, unacknowledged agents of a profound historical transformation. Their legacy, written not in monuments, but in the enduring, stubborn spirit of those who dare to journey into the unknown, whatever the cost.